Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. The village of Heathercombe, with its gently sloping lanes and lilac-fringed hedgerows, wore the quiet of spring like a well-fitted shawl. It was in this familiar stillness that Miss Jane Marple arrived, welcomed with warm scones, a kiss on the cheek, and the gentle chatter of our old friend, Mrs. Dampier. The vicarage had changed little since her last visit. Its corridor still scented faintly of beeswax and thyme, its rooms filled with memories more than modern comforts. Mrs. Dampier, a widow of calm temperament and careful charity, had taken residence at the vicarage since her brother-in-law's health had begun to decline. The sewing room, she remarked with mild regret, had not been touched in years. It remained as it was, shuttered, silent, and full of sun-bleached fabrics, folded with the care of a bygone era. "It seems so silly," she said, as they passed its closed door. I never quite knew what to do with it once the girls grew up and left." Miss Marple, who always listened more than she spoke, merely smiled, her blue eyes attentive behind that gentle softness. In Heathercombe, even silence had its history, and every room a memory. It was early the next morning, just as the sparrows began their earnest conversations in the garden hedge, that a strange smell reached the kitchen, bitter and faintly acrid, like wool singed on an iron. Mrs. Dampier wrinkled her nose, and Lily, the young maid, dashed upstairs with her apron flung over her arm. Moments later the alarm was raised. Smoke poured from beneath the door of the sewing room, gray tendrils curling with quiet malice beneath the warped frame. The village, being as efficient in crisis as it was in gossip, responded quickly. Buckets were fetched, and the Heathercombe Brigade, a proud but modest band of men with stiff boots and stiff mustaches, arrived to contain the smoldering damage. No one was hurt, but the fire left behind a thick scent of scorched wood and camphor-laced fabric that clung to the air like a question unanswered. "It must have been the old iron," muttered one, pointing vaguely at the blackened table leg. Yet Miss Marple, standing with her hands folded and her head slightly inclined, observed that the burn pattern on the floor did not spread outward from the socket. No cord remained, and no iron had been found. It was, she thought quietly, a curious place for a fire to begin. As the smoke thinned and the ash settled, one of the firemen, a lad whose mother sang in the church choir, prodded at the scorched cabinet pressed against the far wall. It was an old piece, lacquered oak with ornamental grooves, its surface now blackened and blistered. With a tug, the lower drawer creaked open, revealing little more than cracked bobbins and a spool of thread hardened into a lump. But when he tapped gently along the panel behind it, a hollow sound echoed beneath his knuckles. With a cautious twist of his blade, he loosened a wooden slat, revealing a narrow cavity that had not seen daylight in decades. Miss Marple stepped forward with mild interest, and Mrs. Dampier, quite startled, clutched her handkerchief. Within the hidden recess lay a charred bundle wrapped in oilcloth, badly damaged, yet unmistakably preserved with purpose. The fire had blackened its edges, but the inner fold remained intact. The bundle contained what appeared to be the fragment of a letter curled at its ends, and something soft and scorched nestled beside it. The villagers murmured. Secrets, after all, did not often come to light by accident, especially not in Heathercombe. Miss Marple, with that gentle firmness which lent her the authority of someone both polite and perceptive, reached for the bundle. The letter's ink was faded but legible in parts, scattered phrases peeking through the damage like memories unwilling to fade. Not to be trusted? If she ever finds out, it should go to her. Yet it was the object beside the letter that drew her fingers to pause. It was a ribbon, once deep blue, now scorched at one end and faded by time. A child's ribbon, narrow, velvet, and still retaining a faint trace of lavender water. Its delicacy felt at odds with the darkened ash around it, as though it had refused to be destroyed entirely. Miss Marple turned it over gently. It bore no initials, no embroidery, just softness and memory. Mrs. Dampier gasped when she saw it. "Oh, my word," she murmured, barely audible. That belonged to little Lucy Willoughby. I should say I remember it well." Miss Marple said nothing, but her thoughts stirred. Objects, she had always believed, could be terribly persistent, especially when connected to something never spoken aloud. Mrs. Dampier stood with one hand pressed to her throat, her voice low, as if the ribbon itself demanded reverence. "Why, Jane," she whispered, "that ribbon belonged to poor Lucy, and she died 30 years ago." Miss Marple gave no reply, though her gaze rested thoughtfully upon the relic, now placed upon the small table beside them. The name stirred faint recollections in her mind, of a quiet funeral, of closed blinds at the Willoughby house, of whispered confusion that lingered just long enough before village discretion restored silence. Lucy Willoughby had been the younger of 2 sisters. The story, as told and retold in muffled tones, was that she had drowned in a boating accident not long after her 12th birthday. There had been no scandal, only sorrow, and the affair had disappeared from public memory as gently as a stone dropped into water. But now, this ribbon, this letter, this fire. Miss Marple looked again at the scorched edges of the oilcloth. It had not been forgotten. Something, or someone, had tried to ensure that it never would be remembered, and such efforts, she mused, are rarely made without cause. The death of Colonel Godfrey Willoughby passed through Heathercombe with the quiet solemnity of a slow-turning page. No bells tolled and no grand procession followed, for the colonel had long since retreated from society, his presence at village functions limited to the occasional nod during Sunday service. Still, he had been a fixture, solid, distant, and immovable as the stone lions that flanked the entrance to his estate. His passing left behind more than just an unoccupied manor. It stirred the old vines of curiosity, which had been dormant for some years. The colonel, after all, had no acknowledged heir. His late wife, Cecilia, had died some 2 decades prior, and the family had seemingly dwindled after the drowning of their younger daughter, Lucy, in childhood. A tragedy which had quietly severed many village friendships. Now there was to be the reading of a will, and Heathercombe, being what it was, could not resist the soft rustling of speculation. Mrs. Dampier observed it all with her usual gentleness, while Miss Marple, sitting near the fire, with her knitting motionless in her lap, seemed to gaze past the flames, not unkindly, but with the faint air of someone remembering what others had chosen to forget. When Clarissa Vane stepped down from the carriage, the village took note, not with open remark, but with the sort of silence that grows weighted with recognition. She had not set foot in Heathercombe in 30 years, and time had done little to warm her presence. Her beauty, once spoken of in whispers laced with awe and hesitation, had refined into something austere. Angular cheekbones, an impeccable hat, a gloved hand resting precisely upon the crook of her arm. She greeted no one. The villagers recalled her as the elder daughter of the colonel, too old to be Lucy's playmate, too haughty to be loved by children or maids. When Lucy had drowned, it was Clarissa, who had vanished soon after, sent abroad or elsewhere, depending on who was asked. Some said she had married well and divorced better. Others muttered of quiet scandals and rooms let under false names. No confirmation ever followed. Now she returned not as daughter, but as claimant, or so it was assumed. Her presence stirred dust long settled, and her eyes lingered on the vicarage with faint contempt. Miss Marple, from the parlor window, observed her arrival without haste. In Clarissa's bearing there was no grief, but there was purpose, and that in Heathercombe often meant more. Clarissa was not alone. With her came Mr. Horace Finch, a solicitor of the sort who knew precisely how long to hold a pause when reading legal documents. His voice was like varnished wood, smooth, old, and slightly warped. He claimed to have represented the colonel's interests in his final years, though no one recalled seeing him at church or fete. He had a way of leaning forward slightly when he spoke, as though his words were more valuable if whispered. Trailing behind was Miles Daring, whose introduction arrived several steps before he did. "A cousin," was how Mrs. Dampier explained it to Miss Marple, though the exact nature of the relation remained nebulous. Miles was affable, well-dressed in a slightly theatrical way, and carried about him the faint scent of spent inheritance. His smile was quick and charming, his remarks often rehearsed. He spoke of London as though it were a stage upon which he had once played a minor but glamorous role. Together the three formed a peculiar triangle. Clarissa guarded and elegant, Finch precise and unreadable, and Miles with the hollow ease of someone trained in borrowed confidence. Miss Marple took their measure quietly, noting how Miles never looked directly at Clarissa for more than a moment. By mid-morning the talk had reached Mrs. Plum's bakery, where truth and rumor were sifted as finely as the flour on her counter. The loaves may have risen slowly, but conversation, once leavened, could not be contained. The reading of the will, it was agreed, would be of particular interest, as the colonel had been known to alter his sentiments almost as often as his garden staff. Reverend Dampier offered measured reflections on the fleeting nature of legacy, though his voice was nearly drowned out by Lily, the maid, who insisted she had seen Clarissa speaking in hushed tones to Mr. Finch before the service began. She was clutching her handbag like it held secrets. Lily sat with the air of someone who had seen secrets before. Speculation turned toward the estate. Would Clarissa claim it by birthright? Would Miles make a play for it through charm? And what of Finch? Was he merely the messenger, or something more? The villagers debated in the manner they knew best, by implication, by gesture, by withholding names until they became obvious. At the far end of the shop, Miss Marple selected a modest scone, nodding politely. She required no theories. Not yet. She preferred patterns, and patterns, she knew, always began with repetition. That evening, as twilight fell over the church spire, and the village settled into its quiet habits, Miss Marple sat in reflection. Lucy Willoughby's name had not passed anyone's lips that day, though it hovered like a fragrance in every room. She had been a quiet, thoughtful child, with hair the color of cornflowers, and a peculiar habit of stitching letters into fabric, long after bedtime. Miss Marple remembered visiting the manor once, many years ago, when the child had shyly shown her a sampler embroidered with careful effort, It had read, "Speak only when truth has room." The phrase struck her as peculiar then, too mature for a girl of 10. But Lucy had smiled as if it were merely her own invention. That sampler had not been present in the house after the girl's death, nor had there been mention of it. No memorial hung, no belongings displayed. It was as though Lucy had been carefully folded away. Miss Marple did not suspect murder, not yet, but she knew the difference between grief and concealment, and something about Lucy's memory, so faint, so delicate, felt too deliberately erased, as if the house itself had agreed not to remember. The scorched ribbon lay where Miss Marple had left it, gently pressed between two sheets of blotting paper to preserve what little fragrance remained. Mrs. Dampier had not touched it since its discovery, though her glance drifted toward it more often than she admitted. It was Clarissa who noticed it first, pausing just outside the parlor door. Her eyes, usually precise and indifferent, faltered for a moment when they fell upon the ribbon. She said nothing, but her breath caught, imperceptibly to most, though not to Miss Marple. After a beat too long, she stepped inside and remarked, with strained lightness, that the room had been pleasantly aired. Her gaze, however, remained on the ribbon, as if drawn by memory's reluctant hand. "It should have burned years ago," she said so softly that it might have been mistaken for a stray thought. Then she turned and excused herself. Miss Marple observed her departure with the mildness of one accustomed to silence, revealing more than speech. Her ribbon, a glance, a whisper half-formed. The past, it seemed, had not been buried as deeply as some had hoped. The parlor had grown unusually still, as Mr. Horace Finch cleared his throat with an air of theatrical restraint, and unfolded the document in his gloved hand. The hush in the room was not merely polite. It was expectant, taut, as if the very floorboards had been holding their breath. Death in Heathercombe was rarely final. It lingered in paper and ink, in clauses and signatures, in what was given, and what was withheld. The estate and all accompanying holdings, Mr. Finch intoned, are to be transferred in full to 1 Margot Lane. There was a pause that pressed hard against the silence. The name, unfamiliar to most present, landed like a leaf on still water, small but with unmistakable ripples. Clarissa's lips parted, though she said nothing yet. Miles Daring blinked, as though momentarily uncertain whether to laugh or frown. Mrs. Dampier dropped her knitting needle. No mention was made of Clarissa. Not a parcel of land, not a single heirloom. No trust, no caveat, no gentle explanation tucked beneath the legal phrasing. The will bore the Colonel's signature, dated and witnessed, yet the name it favored had no history here, and the weight of that absence seemed to stretch longer than the document itself. It was some minutes before Clarissa spoke, and when she did, the edge of control in her voice only served to underline the storm it held back. "That," she said carefully and coldly, "is nonsense. Lucy was to inherit not whoever this Margot Lane is." Her gloved hands were stiff at her sides, but her eyes betrayed the heat rising within. She turned sharply to Finch. "You told me he'd amended the will in my favor after Lucy's death. This is forgery, or trickery, and you, sir, are complicit in both." Finch did not flinch, though the set of his mouth tightened. "The will is dated within the final months of the Colonel's life," he replied, "and was witnessed according to law. I can only relay what was left in my care." Clarissa's breath drew in too quickly, and her next words were nearly lost beneath their weight. "She's not even family. She has no claim. None. Her gaze shifted to the ribbon Miss Marple had preserved, the one she had noticed and dismissed, and now glanced at again with something too complicated to name. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, lowered her eyes to her knitting. Sometimes indignation concealed more than injustice. Sometimes it concealed fear. Margot Lane arrived the following day, stepping into Heathercombe with neither grandeur nor apology. She was a woman of perhaps 35, plain in appearance save for the clarity of her eyes, which were the sort one did not often notice immediately, but which lingered in memory like a scent one could not quite place. She dressed simply, spoke softly, and carried with her a small leather valise and an almost painful courtesy. To the villagers she was a stranger, and thus inherently curious. To the household she was an unwelcome surprise. To Miss Marple she was something else entirely. There was a quiet patience in her manner that did not seem feigned, and yet a tension, barely perceptible, in the way she held her hands when seated, as though they remembered tasks long unperformed. Clarissa barely acknowledged her. Miles, ever the gentleman, greeted her with a smile too polished, and Finch offered her a clipped explanation of the will's provisions. Margot accepted all of it with unremarkable composure, but it was her glance toward the stairwell, the briefest flicker of recognition, that gave Miss Marple pause, for strangers, even those with cores, rarely looked upon a home with such familiarity, and familiarity, Miss Marple knew, had its own inheritance. Later that afternoon, Clarissa stood alone before the hallway portrait, an oil rendering of Lucy as a child, sunlit hair tied with a ribbon, needlework in hand. The likeness had always been too still, too perfect, as though commissioned to outlast memory rather than reflect it. Time had dulled the colors but not the pose, nor the peculiar tilt of Lucy's head, which had suggested a question forever unspoken. Clarissa's gaze lingered there longer than she perhaps intended. Her eyes narrowed slightly, though not with fondness. She reached forward, as though to adjust the crooked frame, but her hand dropped before contact. Instead, she stepped back and stared. It was then that Miss Marple, passing quietly behind her, took notice, not of the gaze itself, but of its conclusion. Clarissa turned away not with sadness, nor regret, but with a sharp intake of breath, as though she had remembered something inconvenient rather than precious. The sampler, once stitched by Lucy, had never been displayed. The portrait had taken its place, grand and impersonal. Miss Marple thought again of the ribbon, and of how certain things, however delicately presented, could not quite mask what they replaced. By the second day, the village had done what it always did in the face of uncertainty. It whispered. Margot Lane had said little and claimed less, which made her all the more worthy of speculation. Her accent was debated. Some swore it was not London, others thought it French. Her dress was analyzed and her manner declared either perfectly modest or suspiciously rehearsed, depending on the listener's disposition. In the tea shop, Mrs. Plum recounted her brief glimpse of Margot at the churchyard, alone but seemingly looking for someone. At the post office, the clerk recalled that she'd requested a single telegram be held in confidence, and at the church, Lily, the maid, told anyone who'd listen that she'd caught Margot staring at the choir rail, like she'd sung there once. Miss Marple listened without discouragement, for rumor, she knew, was not always wrong. It was merely imprecise. In Margot's quietness there was a kind of waiting, not deception perhaps, but a silence that had not yet chosen its words. And silence in Heathercombe rarely remained unbroken, It was in the early evening when the vicarage had settled into that soft rhythm between supper and sleep, that Miss Marple wandered into the small room that served as a library and found herself drawn, quite without intention, to the old hymnal collection. Most had not been touched in years. She had meant only to find an evening verse. Her hand paused upon one of the volumes, the oldest, bound in cracked leather. As she opened it, something brittle slipped from between the pages and fell soundlessly onto her lap. A fragment of paper browned with age, edges scorched, the ink faded but not lost. It was the second half of the letter. She read it with care, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The handwriting matched that of the first piece, but this one held the conclusion, a line half burnt and aching with finality. If she ever finds out, it will all unravel. I cannot let her have it. It was never meant for her. Miss Marple folded the letter gently, slipping it into her knitting bag. The words had not been addressed, but they had been hidden, and hiding, she reflected, was always a prelude to something else. Something, or someone, had feared discovery. The rain had begun some time before dawn, fine, insistent, and cold. It washed over Heathercombe like a benediction too weary to bless. In the vicarage, breakfast was yet to be served, when Lily's scream pierced the stillness, sharp and sudden, as a struck bell. Mrs. Dampier, startled from her devotions, dropped her prayer book, while Miss Marple, already seated with her teacup in hand, did not move, but simply closed her eyes for a brief moment. The commotion led to the sewing room, locked since the fire, then reopened only to be cleaned and cleared. But it had not been cleared entirely, it seemed. There, slumped awkwardly in the faded wingback chair, sat the body of Mr. Horace Finch, his head angled slightly, his complexion ashen and strangely composed, as though death had arrived not in violence, but in resignation. Lily wept behind her apron, and Mrs. Dampier busied herself with instructions, as if activity could stave off dread. The others gathered, summoned by haste and morbid curiosity. Clarissa was the last to arrive, her expression unreadable, though she stood a little apart from the rest. Miles murmured something about shock, and Margot turned away, biting her lip. Miss Marple stepped forward only after all others had retreated. The air in the sewing room still bore the faintest trace of scorched wood, and now something sharper, something metallic, and final. The doctor arrived promptly, his diagnosis brisk but reluctant. The cause of death, he declared, was a deep and decisive wound to the neck, angled with precision, not rage. The weapon had already been discovered, lying not far from the chair. It was an ornate pair of embroidery scissors, golden-handled, finely wrought, the kind often gifted rather than purchased. Their age suggested history, but their placement suggested something else entirely. Miss Marple requested a glance. The scissors, though not her own, were not unfamiliar. She had seen such a pair in the sewing room years before, belonging, she believed, to the Colonel's late wife. They had once rested in a velvet-lined box alongside silks of every shade, but that box had long disappeared, and no one had thought to mention its absence. What made the weapon remarkable was not its elegance, but its incongruity. No burglar, no stranger would have selected such an item, not when blunt force or a blade of convenience would have served. This was a weapon of intimacy, of symbolism, chosen not in haste, but in purpose. Clarissa remained composed when informed. Margot turned pale, and Miles inquired with poorly disguised anxiety whether such things happened often in villages. Miss Marple made no remark. Her thoughts, quiet and slow, were already threading themselves through a different tapestry. The constable, newly posted and eager to prove himself, offered a straightforward explanation. Burglary gone wrong. A vagrant, perhaps, or a stranger seeking valuables in a home known to house heirlooms. When startled, he had lashed out and fled. But the theory, though convenient, began to crumble under its own simplicity. Nothing had been taken. Not a vase, not a coin, not even the old silver combs that still lay, untouched, in the drawer nearby. There were no signs of forced entry, no boot prints in the soft earth outside the window, no damage beyond the tragedy itself. Mrs. Dampier frowned, unable to reconcile the idea with the vicarage's gentle order. Lily shook her head emphatically. She had seen no one strange in the house, nor any door left ajar. The villagers, who had come quietly to the hedges with offerings of tea and condolence, agreed that burglars might steal, but they did not select scissors, nor leave untouched the gold-framed clock on the mantel. Miss Marple listened and said little. Her attention was drawn not to what had been left behind, but to what had been placed. The scissors were not merely a tool. They were a statement, and statements, she knew, rarely came from strangers. When Miss Marple was permitted a closer look, she examined the embroidery scissors with a handkerchief, not for fingerprints, which the inspector had already declared absent, but for what might linger invisibly. She brought them close, then paused. A scent clung to the handles, subtle, almost vanished beneath time and rain and the sharpness of death, but it was there. Lavender oil, faint and familiar. Not the pungent kind used in polish or in warding off moths, but the delicate variety often used in hand balm, particularly among ladies of a certain generation. She said nothing immediately, though a thought stirred quietly. Lavender was not worn by many in Heavycombe. Its use had fallen from fashion. But Miss Marple had noticed a faint trace of it, not days ago, when Clarissa had brushed past her in the corridor. An aroma that spoke not of scent, but of habit. A remnant of a London life, perhaps, or something older. Margot, by contrast, smelled only of starch and soap. Lily wore no scent at all. Mrs. Dampier preferred rosewater. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a curious detail. So easily dismissed, so easily lost, yet it clung. And what clung, she had found, often revealed more than what shouted. When the inspector gathered the household to account for movements, the atmosphere shifted subtly, like a parlor clock, running a few seconds slow. Clarissa, calm but with a stiffness that had settled around her shoulders, stated she had been walking in the orchard at the time of the incident. She had, she said, always found rain soothing, and had taken her umbrella for air and solitude. No one could verify the walk, but the umbrella was damp. Margot, for her part, explained that she had visited the church archives, housed temporarily in the curate's cottage. She had hoped to learn more about the Willoughby family. She admitted, though her tone suggested she had not found what she sought. The curate was away. No one had seen her enter or leave. Miles was vague, as Miles often was. Something about reviewing estate papers and feeling quite unwell, which no one contested, though it comforted no one either. Miss Marple listened as she always did, with polite interest and unassuming attention. But it was not what was said that concerned her most. It was the order in which it was said, the rehearsed cadence, the timing of glances. Alibis, she thought, were often built on shadows, and shadows moved with the light. It was later that day, as the investigation gave way to murmurs and quiet interventions, that Reverend Dampier took Miss Marple aside in the vicarage hallway. His expression was troubled, his words low, "I should have said something sooner," he admitted. "But Finch, he spoke to me last week, just in passing. He said there were things in the Colonel's affairs best left untouched, that the past, if stirred, might do more harm than good. I thought it bluster, or perhaps guilt over some legal failing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Such remarks in other circumstances might be dismissed, but Mr. Finch had never struck her as a man prone to idle speculation. His silences had always seemed heavier than his speech, and now, dead by an object once treasured by the Colonel's wife, his warning seemed less abstract, more personal. The Reverend's voice faltered. "Do you suppose that he knew something that endangered him?" Miss Marple did not reply directly. Instead, she considered the nature of secrets, their weight, their shape, their insistence upon surfacing. Finch had not been a man driven by conscience, but he had been driven. And what drives a man, she thought, can also undo him. That evening, unable to shake the unease that had settled around her knitting, Miss Marple returned to the sewing room. It had been tidied, perfunctorily, but there were corners still undisturbed, drawers unopened, boxes untouched. Her hand drifted toward the cabinet where the ribbon had first been discovered, and there, beneath a pile of singed fabric and forgotten lace, she found something, folded, stiff, and grayed with age, a sampler. The threads were faded but unmistakably the work of a child, the letters precise, the border clumsily symmetrical. It had once been colorful, now it whispered. At the center, surrounded by wilting stitched flowers, were the words, "She lied, and I paid." Miss Marple stood for a long time with the sampler pressed gently between her fingers. Lucy's work, without question. A child's voice sown in silence, left behind when words had failed. Her message, not to be admired but understood. There had been two sisters, one forgotten, one returned, and somewhere between them, a truth stitched too tightly to speak aloud. Miss Marple folded the cloth and returned to her room, the weight of the sampler nestled beside her knitting. The fabric might have dulled, but the words were sharp still, and they would lead, as such things always did, to something that could no longer be hidden. Miss Marple had always believed that certain memories, like herbs steeped too long, only gained potency with time. It was with this in mind that she paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Emmeline Croft, now retired from her years as Heathercomb's midwife, but still sharp-eyed and unhurried in her recollections. The kettle whistled softly in the background as they spoke. Miss Marple inquired delicately after the Willoughby children, choosing her words with the same care Mrs. Croft had once applied to measuring drops of laudanum. The old woman, leaning back in her armchair, gazed toward the hearth before replying. There had been unease between Lucy and Clarissa, she admitted. Not of the dramatic variety, but quiet, simmering, and deeply seated. Lucy had been delicate, dreamy, prone to embroidery and solitude. Clarissa, on the other hand, was exacting, sharp-eyed, and dismissive of softness in any form. They were never quite sisters in the true sense, she murmured, more like shadows of one another. Lucy was always disappearing into her thoughts, and Clarissa was always watching her do it. Miss Marple nodded, noting how easily Mrs. Croft's voice settled into the past. Sometimes it was only in the safety of distance that truths dared to emerge. As the firelight crackled gently, Mrs. Croft's voice dropped to a more thoughtful cadence. "There was a day," she said, "when Clarissa disappeared entirely." She recounted the incident with the vague precision of memory softened by age. Clarissa had been no more than 12 when she vanished for nearly an entire day. The household had been thrown into quiet disarray. Servants had been sent to search the grounds, the riverbank, and the stables, though no alarm had been raised publicly. When Clarissa returned that evening, bedraggled and silent, she offered no explanation. Her arm bore a long, shallow scratch that had since scarred white. More curious, Mrs. Croft recalled, was the locket Clarissa wore upon her return. Delicate, silver, and clearly not from the family collection. The item was not new, but neither had it been seen before. She wore it briefly in the weeks that followed, and then it vanished, never mentioned again. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. The scratch was interesting, yes, but the locket more so. Children do not acquire jewelry without adult hands offering it, and disappearances, even brief ones, often coincide with knowledge meant to be hidden, not shared. Later that week, as the air grew heavy with impending rain and the scent of wild lavender, Margot Lane approached Miss Marple with a reserve that seemed less guarded than resolved. It was in the vicarage parlor, between 2 cups of lukewarm tea, that she quietly laid bare what had been kept too long. She explained that the scorched letter, or rather the first half of it, had not been discovered during the recent fire, as the household believed. It had come into her possession years earlier, found folded inside a pressed hymnal, once belonging to her late mother, a woman who had for a brief time been a lady's maid in the Willoughby household. Margot had found the letter by accident, shortly after her mother's death, and had kept it hidden ever since. At first she hadn't understood its significance, but as her own questions about her parentage deepened, and when she recognized her mother's stories for what they were, fragments with deliberate gaps, she began to suspect the truth had been deliberately concealed. Miss Marple listened with her usual grace, her thoughts returning not to what Margot had found, but why it had been hidden at all. Because some letters, she knew, were meant not to be read, but to be buried. It was during a walk through the churchyard one crisp morning that Miss Marple observed Margot again, standing by the yew tree, her gaze lowered, lips parted in silent reverie. What struck her was not the posture, nor even the tears that glistened faintly in her eyes. It was the tune she hummed, low and unthinking, the way a melody sometimes emerges not from memory, but from instinct. The notes were gentle, haunting, and unmistakable to anyone who had heard them before. It was a lullaby, one not commonly sung these days. "Sleep, my little sparrow," a tune once known to have been Lucy's favorite. The child had sung it during church festivals, had embroidered its first lines into the border of a long-lost sampler, had hummed it while stitching alone in the garden. Margot stopped mid-note, unaware she had ever begun. But Miss Marple did not forget. Such fragments of memory often emerged unbidden, not learned but recalled. A song heard in infancy, before the mind has language, but long after the soul has learned to listen. She walked on, her step steady. Songs and samplers, threads and truths. And the past, she thought, has the peculiar way of singing itself forward. With Finch dead and Clarissa's composure drawing comment, it was Miles Daring who became the inspector's next point of interest. His finances, as it turned out, were precarious at best, debts lingering from too many ventures, too few successes. Finch, who had been privy to the colonel's affairs, had declined to offer assistance mere days before his death, citing irregularities of character. The inspector found this sufficient to probe further. Miles had no verifiable alibi, only vague assertions of being in his room reviewing documents. He had moreover expressed frustration over the will, even confiding to Lily that, Some people never earn what they inherit. Such remarks were enough to earn suspicion. Miss Marple, however, regarded Miles with a blend of scrutiny and skepticism. He was a man full of surfaces, certainly, but not the kind that killed with golden-handled scissors. His temper ran short, his charm was reflexive, and his sentiments rarely held weight beyond the moment. More telling was his reaction to Finch's death, not horror nor grief, but discomfort. The discomfort of someone who had relied on lies of omission, and now feared exposure not for what he had done, but for what he had failed to prevent. It was the village grocer's wife, Mrs. Felton, who first mentioned it, casually, as such things often arise in Heathcombe, tucked between a discussion of weather and laundry. She had seen Mr. Finch and Clarissa in the churchyard 2 evenings before the murder, speaking in tones too hushed to be heard but too intense to ignore. Clarissa had stood stiffly, her gloved hands balled at her sides. Finch had leaned closer, gesturing with abrupt impatience. At one point, Clarissa had turned away, only to whirl back again as if in protest. It had not been a conversation. It had been a reckoning. Miss Marple noted this, her mind returning to the second half of the letter, particularly the line that warned of everything unraveling. Finch had known something. Clarissa, evidently, had known he knew. And churchyards, for all their peacefulness, were excellent places to bury the past, both literally and in persuasion. Words spoken at dusk rarely vanish with the light. They cling, they echo, and when remembered they tend to lead to darker places. The toy box had not been touched in years. It sat, inconspicuously, in the attic chamber once belonging to Lucy, its edges worn smooth with time. Miss Marple, assisted by Mrs. Dampier's willingness to indulge a curious turn of thought, had requested to see it. It was beneath the false bottom, a clever insert covered in quilted gingham. That she found it, a small parcel wrapped in yellowing muslin, bound with a child's hair ribbon. Within it, folded carefully and still intact, lay a birth certificate. The name, printed in careful ink, was not Clarissa's, nor was it Lucy's. It read, Margot Eleanor Lane, born to Cecily Willoughby, registered in confidence, father unnamed. Miss Marple remained still for some time. Then she refolded the paper, her expression unreadable, her eyes alive with thought. It was not merely the presence of the certificate that mattered. It was its concealment, placed where only a child might remember it, preserved where adult hands had no reason to search, and guarded perhaps by silence, shame, or the desperate wish to protect. In that moment the tangled threads began to form their pattern at last, not complete, not yet, but clear enough to follow. And she would follow it to its final stitch. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, when Miss Marple asked that the principal figures be gathered in the vicarage drawing-room. There was no formal summons, no raised voice or demand, merely a polite suggestion made over tea, which Mrs. Dampier conveyed with the understated efficiency peculiar to women accustomed to clergy households and delicate crises. Clarissa arrived first, composed as ever, a silk scarf arranged just so at her throat. Miles followed, looking unusually subdued, as though sensing that his presence was less performance and more penance. Margot sat near the window, her expression guarded yet attentive, her hands folded with unnatural stillness. Mrs. Dampier stood by the hearth, concern shadowing her features, and Inspector Graves, though uninvited, found himself respectfully admitted, curiosity edging his official detachment. Miss Marple remained seated near the tea tray, her knitting laid aside, her posture as mild and unthreatening as ever. Yet the air in the room shifted, like a draught through a house whose windows had been closed too long. She spoke gently without flourish. "It seems to me," she said, "that this tragedy, Mr. Finch's death, did not occur in isolation. It was the final stitch in a tapestry woven long ago, one that began with a lie so quietly sewn. Most forgot it was never truth to begin with." No one interrupted. The room, for the first time in weeks, listened completely. Miss Marple continued with quiet precision, as though unraveling a tangle of thread no one else had noticed. "Clarissa Vane," she said, turning her gaze kindly yet firmly upon the woman, "was not born a Willoughby. She was brought into the household under a veil of discretion, an adopted child, taken in during a time when such arrangements were spoken of only in whispers." The silence that followed was not stunned, but rather the kind that comes when something long suspected is finally confirmed. Clarissa's chin lifted, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of a defensive flinch. "There was no birth announcement," Miss Marple said. "No family resemblance, no infant memories recounted by the staff. But there was, I have come to believe, a need to preserve appearance, particularly for the sake of Colonel Willoughby's inheritance line." Mrs. Dampier made a soft, startled sound, as if remembering something buried beneath years of polite forgetfulness. "You were raised as Lucy's elder sister," Miss Marple added. "But Lucy was the true-born daughter, the one whose claim was both natural and legal. When she died, or was thought to have died, it left you, adopted but unacknowledged, in a precarious position." Clarissa's expression did not waver, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, and finding none there, let it fall gently back to her lap. "The tragedy of Lucy's drowning," Miss Marple said softly, "was, I believe, a carefully orchestrated disappearance. Not her own doing. She was far too young. But someone in the household, perhaps a maid, perhaps a nurse, was persuaded or compelled to spirit her away." Her gaze settled briefly on Margot. "And that child was raised under a different name, in modest circumstances, far from the Willoughby estate. She grew up without knowledge of her parentage, but traces remained. Her ribbon, a lullaby, the instinct to stitch verses into cloth." Margot's posture had stiffened, but she said nothing, her face pale and still. "I have no proof of who took Lucy, nor why they chose not to return her," Miss Marple continued. "But I do know this. She did not die. She became Margot Lane." There was a breathless pause, and then a long, slow exhale, though it was unclear from whom. The second birth certificate, hidden in a toy chest beneath the nursery floorboards, confirmed what Lucy never knew. It named Cecily Willoughby as her mother. No father was listed. Perhaps he had already passed, or perhaps his name was never intended to be recorded. Margot looked away, her throat tight. It was not grief, but the weight of a truth so long deferred that it no longer shocked, only settled, like dust returning home. Miss Marple turned now to the matter of the Colonel's intentions, her voice measured but clear. "Colonel Willoughby," she said, "was not unaware. He may not have known the full truth, but I believe he suspected it in his final years. It explains why, after decades of silence, he altered his will, to redirect his legacy to Margot Lane, a name he had likely been told never to speak aloud." Clarissa shifted, her expression sharpening. "Had Lucy remained in the family, There would have been no ambiguity. She was the rightful heir, by blood and by law. But her death left a void that others sought to fill. Clarissa, being the only one present, was naturally assumed to inherit. Miss Marple looked to the inspector. But it was not law that determined the colonel's last wishes. It was conscience, or perhaps guilt. She paused, letting the implication settle. The will, rediscovered in Mr. Finch's keeping, was no trick. It was the colonel's final effort to right what had been concealed. He could not speak the truth, but he left a trail, a hidden draw, a sampler, a buried certificate. Miss Marple folded her hands. It was not simply an inheritance he left behind. It was a confession, stitched through silence. And then she turned her attention at last to the murder. Mr. Finch, Miss Marple said gently, was not a foolish man, but he was an ambitious one. And ambition, when tied to knowledge, can become dangerous. She nodded toward the inspector. We know that Finch recently quarreled with Clarissa, not once but twice, once in private, once, according to Mrs. Felton, in the churchyard. Clarissa sat still, though her knuckles whitened. He had discovered the truth, or enough of it to bargain with. Perhaps he came upon the letter. Perhaps he pieced it together from the same documents I found. But he used it, not to inform the authorities, but to corner Clarissa. He sought influence, favor, possibly a share of the estate. Miss Marple's eyes were steady. But Finch miscalculated. He believed that holding a secret was the same as holding power. What he failed to grasp was that Clarissa had much more to lose. The inspector shifted slightly, as if seeing something anew. In desperation, Miss Marple continued, Clarissa turned to the only weapon that symbolized everything she had stolen, a pair of golden embroidery scissors, once belonging to the colonel's wife. She used them to silence the man who threatened to unravel her position. Clarissa's face had paled, but she made no move to speak. Her silence no longer carried dignity. It carried weight. It was not one clue, but many, Miss Marple said quietly, scattered threads that only needed weaving. She gestured delicately. There was the scorched ribbon, child-sized, faintly lavendered, buried and then unearthed. A keepsake once worn by Lucy, kept hidden until the fire brought it back to light. She turned to Margot, her voice soft. There was the lullaby, Sleep, My Little Sparrow, which no adult now sings, but which you hummed in the churchyard, unconsciously, a melody tied to memory before language could frame it. She continued, There was the sampler. She lied, and I paid. Not the verse of a child untroubled, but of one who knew betrayal, who believed herself sacrificed to protect another. Lucy's final message, preserved in thread. Then she addressed Clarissa. And there were the embroidery scissors, unused for decades, touched by no one, yet scented faintly with lavender oil, which only you wore. No fingerprints remained, but scent is memory's fingerprint. The room held its breath. I watched you falter at the sight of the ribbon. I watched your eyes fix too long upon the portrait. I heard the silence in your answers, answers that held no lies, but held everything back. She folded her hands. These were the stitches of truth, not loud, not obvious, but precise and unbreakable. Clarissa did not speak at first. The silence stretched, not in defiance but in defeat. Her hands, once still, trembled now in her lap. She looked not at Miss Marple nor at the inspector, but at the empty space between them all, as if some long-buried ghost had finally stepped into the room. "I never meant for it to go so far," she whispered at last. "But he always loved Lucy best, even in death." There was no rage in her voice, only sorrow, old, cold, and deep. A sorrow grown around something once tender and twisted into something else. "I was brought in to fill a space," she said, her voice distant. "But she was never meant to leave. Not truly. And when she did, everything I had became borrowed." She did not protest when the inspector moved to stand, nor when Mrs. Dampier quietly wept into her handkerchief. Clarissa simply rose, composed herself, and walked to the door. And in her absence, the silence no longer pressed. It simply settled. Clarissa left the vicarage not in handcuffs, nor under the cruel glare of disgrace, but with the subdued solemnity of a woman who had long accepted that her part in a play was ending. The inspector had granted a measure of discretion. There were papers to be filed, of course, formalities to complete. But she offered no resistance. Her farewell, if it could be called that, was no more than a glance at the garden as she stepped into the waiting carriage. Outside the sewing room, the roses had begun to bloom, early for the season, their pale petals unfolding along the trellis, as though unaware of the drama that had unfolded beneath their watch. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the parlor window, noted their blush. "Roses are stubborn," she had once told Mrs. Dampier. "They bloom in spite of tragedy, not because of it." Clarissa made no final speech, no apology, no defense. She looked not at Margot, nor at Miss Marple, but at the hedgerow, bending faintly in the wind. Her composure did not falter, but something in her carriage had slackened, as though she had finally stopped holding herself together. As the carriage disappeared from view, the silence left in its wake was not accusatory. It was, instead, the solemn kind, the sort of quiet one finds after a storm has passed, and nothing is quite as it was, but everything remains. When the solicitor returned to speak of legal entitlements and estate transfer, Margot Lane, now acknowledged as Lucy Willoughby, listened with the calm detachment of one who had already made her decision. She had not come to Heathercombe to claim land or wealth. She had come unknowingly, in search of a history denied to her. And now that it had been returned, she found herself oddly reluctant to hold it. The Willoughby estate, in all its stone and legacy, had never felt like hers. It was memory without resonance, a name without the shape of home. What she had found in Heathercombe, quiet conversations, the gentle rhythm of village bells, the kindness of Mrs. Dampier's tea, was of far greater substance. So she declined the inheritance, not out of bitterness nor principle, but from a place of quiet clarity. The estate would be given to the church or held in trust. She asked only to remain in the village, to work at the local school, and to live modestly in the gardener's cottage that had been unoccupied for some years. Miss Marple, when informed, merely nodded. There was strength in renunciation, she thought, and in knowing the difference between restoration and revenge. Lucy had not reclaimed a title. She had restored her name. Some days later, Miss Marple and Mrs. Dampier resumed their familiar habit of afternoon tea, the kind that began with buttered scones and ended, as so often it did, in thoughtful silence. The rain had passed, the roses were blooming, and the vicarage parlor was once again as it had been before, but never quite the same. "Human nature," Mrs. Dampier murmured, "is a terribly complicated thing." Miss Marple agreed, as she always did, with a quiet hum and a careful spooning of jam. "It is not unlike embroidery. she said at length. "What seems a simple design can, upon closer inspection, reveal all manner of irregularities, knots hidden at the back, colors that do not match, and sometimes it is the tiniest stitch that throws the pattern off completely." Mrs. Dampier smiled, though her eyes were tired. "And yet we do our best to keep the threads neat." "We do," Miss Marple said. "And that, I think, is what redeems us. Even those who err terribly often began with a desire for order, for recognition, for love. Clarissa was not wicked, merely misaligned." The conversation turned, as it always did, to lighter matters. Yet in the steam rising from their teacups and the faint scent of lavender lingering on the window-sill, something of the past still hovered, like a final stitch waiting to be tucked beneath the fold. In the days that followed, Heathercombe returned to its natural tempo, a soft resumption of routine rather than a declaration of normalcy. The scandal, such as it was, faded into the folds of local memory, recounted with discretion at market stalls, hinted at during hymn practice, and eventually transformed into legend by those who hadn't seen the truth firsthand. The church bells resumed their weekly rhythm. Mrs. Plum's bakery reopened with rhubarb tarts. The vicar, perhaps unconsciously, began his sermons with less fire and more forgiveness. Even Miles Daring, whose name had once drawn suspicion, departed the village under the polite fiction of pressing obligations in town, leaving behind only a poorly paid tab at the inn. Margot, or rather Lucy, became known not as an heiress but as a quiet addition to the community. She was seen walking children to school, helping with church flowers, and humming very softly as she passed the churchyard yew tree. Only the sewing room remained untouched. Its door, though no longer scorched, stayed closed, more from respect than fear. It was understood without discussion that some spaces, like certain memories, must be allowed to settle undisturbed. Miss Marple passed the room often but never paused. There was no need. The thread, after all, had already been pulled through. On a morning both ordinary and golden, with bees weaving among the roses and the church bell chiming faintly in the distance, Miss Marple sat once again with her knitting. The pattern was new, though the needles were well worn, and the wool a soft pale blue, not unlike the ribbon discovered weeks before. She thought, not unkindly, of Clarissa. There had been ambition in her, yes, but also fear. The fear of being set aside, of vanishing behind the portrait of a sister who had every right to shine. Clarissa had clung to a role given to her without warning, and when that role began to unravel, she had tightened the threads until they cut through her own dignity. In that, Miss Marple thought, there was tragedy, not merely for the victim, but for the one who had chosen the darker path to remain seen. Then there was Finch, a man who thought leverage could replace loyalty, and who gambled on silence rather than truth. His end had been brutal, but it had come not from cruelty, but calculation, the misjudgment of one who believed knowledge could shield him. But it was Lucy, quiet Lucy, who lingered most in Miss Marple's mind. A child erased, a girl renamed, a woman who returned without intention of revenge. There was something rare in that, something gently heroic, to have been wronged so thoroughly, and yet seek no retribution. Her refusal of the estate had been the final grace in a story muddied by self-interest. Justice, Miss Marple had always believed, was not only the matter of law, but of restoration, the restoring of a name, of a place, of a truth, long folded and kept in darkness. She paused her knitting and glanced toward the garden. The sampler now hung in the hallway. not in pride but in remembrance. Its stitched warning no longer carried menace, but understanding. She lied, and I paid. It still read, but now it spoke more of history than accusation. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the quiet click of needles filling the morning stillness. She reflected, as she often did after such affairs, on the delicate architecture of secrets, how they bent around love, survival, shame, and pride. And as she tied off the final loop in the row, she murmured to no one in particular, "Truth, like thread, has a way of showing through, no matter how long it's been buried beneath the seams." And the roses, untouched by grief or guilt, continued to bloom. And so, the mystery has been laid to rest, not with grand spectacle but with quiet truths, revealed and long-silenced voices finally heard. In the end, it wasn't revenge or justice in its harshest form that brought peace to Heathcombe, but recognition of who Lucy truly was, of what Clarissa had become, and of how the smallest thread, a ribbon, a sampler, a lullaby, can carry the weight of generations. Miss Marple as ever reminded us that evil often wears a human face, not monstrous but wounded, and terribly afraid of being forgotten. And that is perhaps the deepest thread running through this story, the longing to be seen, and the terrible things we sometimes do to protect. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.